literally the second we walked through the doors to the labor and delivery room, my contractions got unbearable. And it was like walking through that threshold was like, I just don't know, because I hadn't mentally prepared for that at all.
Welcome. This is a Journey to Birth podcast coaching session. I'm Tristan, the creator of the Natural Birth Compass online childbirth education program. And on this coaching series, you will hear me help Starre, one of our Natural Birth Compass students who is a second-time mom preparing for her birth experience after unexpected events required some changes in her first birth. Now, a couple of notes before we jump in. This is a real live coaching call. I knew very little about Starre before we started this call. Now, I do have my coaching clients fill out a brief questionnaire beforehand, but all I know at the start of our calls is what they're hoping to achieve out of our coaching sessions. In this first episode of her coaching series, Starre will share her birth story. Then we will analyze the aspect of her birth that went well for her, the lessons that she learned from it, and what she would like to prepare differently for her upcoming birth. And then we'll lay out the plan for our series of coaching calls. I hope you're able to join us for the full series as we help Starre on her journey to birth. Now, this call was a lot of fun. I hope that you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed recording it. Welcome on the Journey to Birth podcast, Starre. I want to thank you for being our brave first mom to come on to the show for a round of coaching. I know that it can be a bit vulnerable to share your birth story, and to do something like this, getting coaching on a podcast that's going to be public about something that can feel a little bit overwhelming, something that's so personal. So I really want to start off by just giving you a big thanks from me and from everybody who's going to hear this podcast and who's going to benefit from hearing you and your story on this show and join you on your journey to birth.
Well, absolutely. I'm excited to join you.
So this is your second pregnancy, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And how many weeks along are you now?
I'm 24 weeks.
Okay. And how old is your first little one?
She is 22 months now.
22 months. Okay. So it's been almost 2 years.
Yeah. She'll be two, exactly 2 months.
Okay. Great. So how is ones, almost twos going for you guys so far?
They are, well, ones are exactly what I expected two to be like.
Yep.
So I think that that's a little mispublished. Mm-hmm. You hear so much about the terrible twos. I feel like it starts at about 14 months. And the more I talk to, I hear the same thing. So that's been fun. But I don't know. I'm fairly passionate about parenting and being very intentional about it. So I've been having a lot of fun, like researching what's going on in my baby's brain. How do I help her like grow into a 2-year-old? Because they really start that transition from like into a 2-year-old right after they turn 1. So, you know, there's fits, there's attitudes, but me and my husband are really enjoying it. He looks at me all the time and says, I love having a 1-year-old. So we'll see what having a 2-year-old is like.
Yeah, it's a fun age. It's such a whirlwind of an age.
It's crazy, yeah.
Too, yeah. With mine, I think one was not so bad. 2 was actually not so bad. It was 3 that felt more like that was, I won't say terrible, but 3 is more, what happened in the 3rd year was more what I thought the 2nd year was going to be.
Yeah.
So just be prepared.
Yeah. There's more coming.
There might be more coming.
Yeah.
So your first birth, you had planned a home birth with a midwife. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Could you tell me a little bit about that? Why you had chose a home birth and a midwife for your first birth? Yeah,
absolutely. So I am one of 7 children. My mom had all of us either at home or at her midwife's house. And so for me, birth was never a scary thing, and I never thought about it as a medical thing. And as I got older and I had friends that started having kids, I would hear about, like, they found out they were pregnant and they went straight to an OB. And I thought that was really bizarre. to be totally honest. And I know it's the norm. And my mom never really talked to us about birth. It was just what felt normal to me. We would go to like grandma and grandpa's and we'd come home and there was a baby and mom and dad never left. So for me, that's what felt normal. It's what felt comfortable. And as I started to watch people having kids really as young as like 18, 19, 20, I became very passionate about birth because I knew it didn't have to be awful, but I would hear awful stories. So then I watched The Business of Being Born prior to ever even like being close to having my own children. And it kind of solidified in my mind, this is like a really wonderful natural thing as long as medically all things align. So why make it a medical event? So as soon as I found out I was pregnant, I just immediately started looking into midwives in the area. I interviewed a few. However, when I interviewed my midwife, she was actually the first interview that I did. I called my older sister, who at the time had 3 children. I called her and I said, am I allowed to just pick the first one because I know she's the one? And she said, well, finish out the interviews you have, but you might be right. And I totally was. We clicked. I took my husband to meet her for like my first real appointment, which was probably at 10 or 12 weeks. And he loved her too. And he's a very, like, he's more just kind of like serious and doesn't get excited about people type of a person. And he even said, I remember we got in the car and he's like, wow, I really liked her. So I was like, perfect. She's the one. I like her. You like her. So that's how the process of, finding our midwife happened.
That is a very unique story. Most people your age and even my age haven't really had that experience of out-of-hospital births, and coming to that already as being something that's the norm. That's very unique and interesting for you. So that was probably not something that you really thought about until that point when your friends started having their own babies and they were going to the hospital, even though they were healthy and there was nothing wrong.
Yeah. I really hadn't processed it. Like I said, my mom never really talked to us about, I was a kid, so I have 4 younger siblings. I'm number 3. And like I said, she didn't talk about the fact that we chose to have a baby at home. I just didn't even know until I was, probably in my early teens that people didn't even do that. And I don't think that I thought, oh, that's weird. Why are they in the hospital? I just didn't think anything of it. And then I should have mentioned my older sister. So she had 3 kids at the time of the birth of my child. And she had 2 home births. Her first was in a hospital with a midwife because of her insurance not covering a home birth. And I was at the birth of that baby. So that was her first. And she invited me to be there. So I spent like the last 8 hours of her labor and then delivering at the hospital. And it wasn't a bad experience by any means. There was little tiny interventions, like they broke her water, tiny little things. But for the most part, it was a great vaginal delivery. And that really made me feel more empowered. Like I watched her do it and thought, that looks really, really hard, but I know I could do it. And that was my feeling walking away from that birth. And so I think it just solidified for me even more, this doesn't have to be like this big deal and we have to rush to the hospital. So yeah.
Wow. So you come from a very lucky background in that regard, yeah. I think.
Yeah. Because I just have that comfort and confidence with birth in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. That's great. And finding your right midwife on the first try. I had that experience too. The very first midwife I interviewed, we just connected right away and I knew she was the one. And then the same thing, I brought my partner to the first full visit, and because he wasn't necessarily on board with the home birth midwife thing from the start, but I took him to go meet her and she completely put him at ease to where he was on board with it after that very first visit.
Awesome.
That, midwives have a way. When you have the right midwife, they really have a way.
They do. I agree.
So now tell me about what happened with that birth.
Yeah. What caused the hospital transfer?
Yes. So you had planned a home birth, but you didn't end up having a home birth in the end.
Yes.
Okay.
So I, well, to keep it like not too lengthy, so I started having contractions on, so she was born Monday night. I started having contractions on Friday afternoon. And they were consistently 5 minutes apart for basically 2.5 days. So all day Friday, Saturday, Sunday, my contractions were 5 minutes apart, exactly like clockwork. I could talk through them. I was uncomfortable, but I could talk and walk for the most part. I didn't have to stop often. Sometimes I did. And so when they started on Friday, I woke up the next morning and I told my husband, like, if I'm feeling good, I want to go out for breakfast. It'll be our last breakfast out and we'll go for a walk afterwards. And so we did that. We went out to breakfast and like I was able to eat a fair amount. We went for a walk. And it like I felt okay doing that. But the contractions just stayed 5 minutes apart the entire day. So then Sunday morning, I woke up and I will say I was sleeping fairly well Friday and Saturday night. I slept fairly well for consistently having contractions 5 minutes apart. I slept pretty poorly my whole third trimester, so it was pretty similar to that. And so Sunday morning, I woke up and I was pretty over it at that point. I was like, I'm not timing these anymore. Like, I hadn't been timing them all the time, but I would, pull my phone out and make sure, yep, there's still just 5 minutes. So I woke up Sunday morning and was just kind of done with the whole thing. I was like, I don't want to do this. We had a family birthday party that afternoon, and I told my husband, like, I'm not going. If one person asks me when this baby is coming, like, I might strangle them. Oh, I should mention, I was 40. So when the contraction started, I was 40 weeks and 2 days. So by Sunday, I was 40 weeks and 4 days. And so he went to the party without me. I decided to take myself on a date. So I went to a park and I literally did side squats, like a quarter of a mile walking one way and a quarter of a mile the other way. Cause I just was so over it and I wanted the contractions to do something else. I now know that there was like positioning issues with the baby, but I had no idea at the time. And I had sort of looped my midwife in, but I was also comfortable with like where I was, and they were only 5 minutes apart. So she hadn't like come to check me, and we just briefly talked on the phone. So on Sunday, I went and did that and like went home, took a bath, and everything still was basically the same. The intensity did not really change this entire time. So fast forward, same thing all night. Sunday through the evening, I slept fairly well Sunday night. I woke up and I on Monday morning and I was like, I'm not having this baby. Like, I give up. I'm all done. So I actually texted my mother-in-law and I said, let's go get pedicures. It's like 7 a.m. I'm like, let's go get pedicures. We're going as soon as they open. I just need to pretend like this isn't happening because I was just getting very frustrated. So I had gotten, dressed, throw my hair in a ponytail, and about 8:30, I was going to meet her at 9. And about 8:30, the contractions got a little bit stronger. So I was like kneeling on the floor, leaning on my bed, and I felt a pop. I was like, oh, that's weird. That kind of felt like my water just broke, but there was no water. So I got up and walked to the bathroom. And when I sat down on the toilet, that's like when I got like a bit of a gush, I guess you would say. But for me, it was not like this waterfall. It was like a lot of sludgy meconium. And that was like, it was very, it was my water breaking, but I wouldn't call it water. So I immediately called my midwife and said, okay, my water just broke, but it's like totally full of meconium. What do you want me to do? And she was like, well, send me a picture because I had sat down on the toilet. So it was all right there. So I sent her a picture And she looked at it, and we're still on the phone. And she said, okay, I'm going to come to you. I want you to get ready to start thinking about if we have to go to the hospital. So when she saw it, okay, that's a lot of meconium. And she was really calm. She didn't say any of that to me. She just said, I'm coming to you, but I want you to think about that. So I called my husband and my sister, who was going to be at the birth, and I let them know my water broke. My midwife, my sister, and my husband pretty much all got to my house at the same time. My sister got there first, so she actually pulled up a Pinterest list for like a hospital bag because I didn't have one. And the whole time, my whole pregnancy, everyone had told me, like, just have one just in case. All the stuff will be together. If you don't need it, it'll be helpful. But of course, I didn't. So at that point, my contractions immediately went to like 2 minutes apart the second my water broke. So I am like in between contractions, trying to walk around the house and find stuff as she's reading me a list, and then I'd stop and like have a contraction. So my midwife got there and she checked me, and after 2.5 days, I was still only 2 centimeters dilated. And so she said, we can stay here and do this a little bit longer if you want, but if it's too long, I'm going to want you to go to the hospital because of the amount of meconium. And the hospital was like 40 minutes away, and we weren't quite ready to go anyway. And so we actually, I pulled up my laptop. I was so not prepared. Pulled out my laptop because I was searching on our insurance page what hospitals were in network, because I knew I didn't want to go to the closest one, which I knew was in network, but they're very hostile towards home birth transfers. So I knew I didn't want to go there. So we're like looking up all the hospitals. We decided where we were going to go. And we just thought by the time we get there, like, we're just going to do this. Like, I'm 2 centimeters dilated. I've been having contractions 5 minutes apart for 2.5 days. Like, we're just going to go. If that's what the baby needs, that's what we'll do. So they got me all in the car. She put me on antibiotics at home for the meconium. And at the time, I totally trust her. So I didn't even ask questions. I maybe would at least ask some more questions than I did then, but she put me on an IV drip for antibiotics, I think knowing the hospital was going to want to. And we went to the hospital. She had called a doctor that she trusted to be my doctor, my OB. She called him and said, hey, I'm heading to the hospital and you're going to deliver this baby. Basically, he was not at work that day. So when we showed up, they were really kind. They really were. That part of the experience was fine. They wanted to assign the on-call OB to me. So there was a little bit of a back and forth, like, no, this is the doctor we're having. Our midwives already talked to him, and they're like, well, he's not here. And we're like, no, he's our doctor. So that was a little interesting, but ultimately that's why we ended up at the hospital, was because of the amount of meconium.
And now a quick word from our sponsor. I want to tell you about 2 moms and their experience with their childbirth class. They both take a full series of childbirth courses. They both have birth partners who attend those courses. They both learn tools and techniques to manage their labor and birth, but only one of them is actually prepared to help herself during birth. Only one of them is actually confident in her communication tools. And only one of them is actually prepared for the nature of birth. How do I know? I was the mom who took a class, but wasn't prepared to help myself during birth after that class. I was the mom who didn't have the right communication tools. I was the mom who was caught off guard by the nature of birth. And now, because of what I learned from my experiences, my students like Jen and Maria and Susan, who took our online childbirth course, the Natural Birth Compass program, they are the ones who have the inner confidence and knowledge of birth to help themselves, to communicate clearly to their whole birth team, to set themselves up for being strong throughout birth, and to take control of decision-making throughout their birth. Want to know how you can have this level of inner confidence for yourself? Visit us at naturalbirthcompass.com, where you can read how Jen and Maria and Susan used their natural birth compass in their births, and prepare yourself to have the inner confidence you need no matter what path your birth takes. And now, back to your Journey to Birth podcast.
So we got checked in. They took me straight to a labor and delivery room. And it was probably noon at this point. And I will say that there's so much power to like your thoughts and your mentality. And that's one thing that with this next birth, I really am hoping I can be a little bit more present as I'm experiencing those changes so that I can be in more control. But like literally the second we walked through the doors to the labor and delivery room, my contractions got unbearable. And it was like walking through that threshold was like, I just don't know, because I hadn't mentally prepared for that at all. So of course they wanted to like monitor the baby and check the baby. I had the best nurse ever. She's like my godsend. She was so wonderful about the fact that we had wanted a private, intimate home birth, and she did her best to like pull the hospital out of the experience, which was so awesome. So they hooked me up to monitors for like just long enough to make sure everyone was okay. And then I ended up getting in the bath pretty early on. They had really awesome soaker tubs. And so I got in the tub, and it honestly did not help at all, but it slowed the contractions down. And I was like probably in the tub for about half an hour. And while I was in the tub, I looked at her and I was like, okay, I want you to go over all of my pain options again. So she's like listing all these options, and I knew I didn't want an epidural. And she's like telling me all of them. And I looked at my husband and I'm like, I just can't do it. I'm not comfortable with any of them. So she was like, it's okay. Like, we can do this. We'll help you like get through it, because the pain was just so much more than I expected. And it's funny because a lot of people have said like, oh, was the car ride awful? Because at that point, I mean, my contractions were 2 minutes apart the entire 40-minute car ride. And I was fine. Like, I was having contractions, but I was like, no, I mean, it's fine. But it was just like that. I lost control of my psyche when I walked in that hospital room. So I got out of the bath. I was like angry that the contractions had slowed down. So I was like, I'm getting out of here. This isn't working. Like it to me, it hurt just as bad, if not worse, being in the tub. And so we got out. Then they checked me, and I was 4 centimeters. So I was like a little annoyed that I was only 4 centimeters, but at the same time was like, well, it's better than nothing. My midwife, I didn't mention this. So she brought us to the hospital. She left to take her birthing assistant home, and she came back around 4 o'clock, 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I was kind of struggling up until that point. I was definitely running away from the pressure of the contractions. My husband was really awesome. He had helped me try and do some of the stuff that we had learned in our childbirth class. I did really intermittent monitoring during this time. Nothing like too crazy, but literally the phone would ring in the room and I'd hear my nurse kind of argue with them, and she'd be like, okay, well, how long? And she'd be like, okay, I have to hook you up to the monitor, but only for 10 minutes. So she would like bargain with them, like what was the minimum she could get away with. So she was wonderful. And so there was some monitoring in that time, but for the most part, I was just miserable, not allowing the contractions to like open my body up at all. And was just not handling like the pressure. I literally had playing like in a loop in my head, I will never do this again. I will never do this again. I will never do this again. So my midwife showed back up right when a student doctor wanted to come in and check me. So I got up on the bed. I pretty much only got on the bed for them to check me. I didn't go near it the rest of the time. Got on the bed and she checked me and she's like, okay, you're about 4.5, 5 centimeters. So I barely progressed in like 2 hours. She said, you're about 4.5, 5 centimeters, but I'm not entirely sure like your water fully broke. So I'm going to go get the doctor because I want him to check. And he came in. That was the first time I met him, when he came in to do that. And so he checked me and he said, oh yeah, your water's broken. I'm not sure why she thought that, but he stretched me without telling me. Like he was like, I mean, yeah, you're about 4, 5, you're like 6.5. And he like stretched me as he was telling me how many centimeters I was, which I didn't feel at all. I've heard people say like it was awful, it was horrible. It did not hurt. And I was honestly very happy. I was like, thank you, Jesus, you can stretch me the rest of the way. So when he left, he's like, okay, well, we'll see you soon. Like, you're doing great. So when he left, that's when my midwife really stepped in, and it became like me and her, because she could tell like I was not doing well. And she had let kind of me and my husband do our thing, but she said, okay, and I was on the bed at this point and didn't want to move. And she's like, okay, you're getting down. I'm going to show you what you're going to do, and then you're going to do it. And so she literally grabbed my husband, pretended to be me, and kind of like was demonstrating like a squat while using him to support her. And she's like, okay, I'm getting you up. And she literally pulled me off the bed. And I'm so thankful that she knew me well enough that she could do that. And she knew what I needed. And this is where she was really aware at this point, like position wise, this baby probably isn't putting the right pressure on her cervix. So she got me up and got me moving, and I did not want to do it. I definitely protested quite a bit. We did that for probably a dozen contractions. And then she asked if I wanted to try the shower since I hadn't liked the bath. So we went into the bathroom, just me and her. She turned the shower on, and I literally hung on to the like handlebars in the shower in a really, really, really low squat. Like I was almost sitting on the ground, and she held the shower head on my back. And I spent the next 2 hours in there, which I will say it was probably like the transition from like 7 to 8 centimeters when I like truly thought like I maybe can't do this. And I would just look at her, and I would literally have to stare into her eyes my entire contraction. And she would just be like nodding her head up and down and saying, you can do it, you can do it. Because I mean, I obviously couldn't talk at this point. And I should have mentioned it earlier, but she had, when she saw that I was doing not well during my contractions, she had told me like, okay, you need to let it out, and had kind of taught me how to have like lower tones to my voice. And my like moaning had gotten, I explain it as primal. Like I just knew it's okay, I'm in labor, but any other time in my life, it would have been like horribly embarrassing. But it really helped. So I basically would just like moan really loudly and deeply through every contraction, staring in her eyes. Then I looked at her and I was like, okay, I want you to grab the stool. That there was just like a stool in there. I said, I want you to get that stool, put it in front of the toilet, and I want to sit on the toilet. I was like, I don't have to go to the bathroom. I just want to sit on the toilet. And she's like, okay. So she helps me over there. She gets that all set up. We make it through a contraction or two. She gets me over there. And I sat down on the toilet, and she's like, okay, I'm just going to check and like make sure I don't see anything. Because she had promised the nurse, if you let us go in there alone, I promise you I won't let her have the baby. So she looks, and she's like, oh, I see a head. So she opens the bathroom door, and she's like, I see a head, like baby is getting ready to come. Which, of course, like, part of me wishes she had it promised the nurse that, and I could have just, like, I wanted to stay on the toilet. I would have totally had the baby on the toilet. And so, of course, it gets, like, very hustly in the room when they are like, oh, well, mom's ready to push. So there's people coming in. They're making me move to the bed. The doctor shows up, and well, so when they first put me on the bed, I did not want to lay down. So she had them set up the squat bar, and I was squatting, and he came in and said, okay, we need her on her back. And my midwife argued with him a little bit and was like, why does she have to be on her back? And he's like, that's just like how we're going to do it. And she pushed back, but he was really firm and was like, no, she's going on her back. And at that point, like, I didn't have the strength to advocate for myself. Be like, I don't want to do that. That's not, I really wanted to be in a squatting position. Like, that's what felt comfortable to me. But I finally was like, whatever, like, I'll just, like, I wanted them to stop discussing it. Like, I just couldn't handle it. So I laid on my back, and he was like, yep, you're ready. So they basically started coaching me through pushing. He did let my midwife was on the end of the bed. So they dropped down the bottom of the bed, and he was on like one half of it and she was on the other half, and she really like coached through my birth. So he was wonderful because he allowed her to do that. So it felt like I had a lot of people telling me to push. Like I had her, the doctor, and then my nurse. And I didn't mention, but because of the meconium, like baby had been fine the whole time. There was never any distress, anything. But because of the meconium, they had like an entire NICU team in the room. You know, I remember just looking out into like really bright lights and just seeing like the shape of like dozens of people, what felt like dozens of people. I now know there really were like over 15, but it felt like dozens because there was a student doctor, the OB, my midwife, 2 nurses, and then the whole NICU team, and then my sister, my husband. And the pushing happened really fast. In my memory, like they told me to push what felt like, I don't know, 5 times, and the baby came. I do remember looking at my midwife, and I now know it was probably like right when the baby was crowning and the ring of fire. I looked at her and I just shook my head no. Like I couldn't talk, but I was like, no, I can't. And I remember her being like, you can do it, you can do it. So the pushing part was like the best part for me. If I could have just like only done that, I would have been super happy. The doctor, right as the baby was crowning, took lidocaine cream and like he said lidocaine cream to someone, and they handed it to her or to him, and my midwife had said, why are you doing that? She doesn't need that. And he was like, no, she wants it, she just doesn't know. And she was like, well, what's the evidence behind that? Like, why are you doing that? And he basically just didn't listen and just like smeared lidocaine cream all over me, which was like, whatever. I didn't have time to think about it. My husband was really unhappy about it just because obviously like the baby is like my baby's face is getting rubbed with lidocaine basically. I didn't have time to even really like process it. So he did that. They said push a few more times, and somehow like in between about 7 and 7:37 when she was born, that's about how long the pushing took, but it seemed a lot faster to me. Baby came out. She immediately like let out one cry. She just said, wah! And that was it. She was, I mean, there was no vernix because she was, you know, past 40 weeks. She was fairly clean from hanging out with so much meconium. They handed her to me. I was in total shock that there was really a baby there. And she was 6 pounds, 9 ounces. And I had been told on an ultrasound at 36 weeks that she was 6.5 pounds then. So 5 weeks later, I was expecting a much bigger baby, and all the babies in my family and my husband's have been large. So I was very surprised, and I just kept saying, oh my gosh, she's so tiny. She's so tiny. Why is she so small? And like within 10 minutes, she was nursing. She found it. And like, I remember looking up at my midwife and being like, is it okay? Can I let her do this? They're like, it's fine. So she like nursed right away. And yeah, so all in all, like I felt like it was a really awesome experience for having transferred to the hospital, especially once I got there, having those couple of hours where I felt really defeated and like I might not be able to do it. But yeah, that is my story.
Okay, where do I want to start? There's a lot of things to unpack in here.
Yes.
Overall, when you look back on how this birth unfolded, like what's a word that kind of describes how you felt at the end of this birth?
Honestly, I just felt really proud. That was definitely like my overwhelming. I was like, oh my gosh, that was a million times harder than I thought it was going to be. And I still did it. So I was just honestly very proud.
That is so great to hear. And for me, because we actually have a video going right now, which the listeners of the podcast won't be able to see you, but I can really see that coming through in your face as you get to the end of this birth story. I can see that joy and that accomplishment really coming through on your face, even on this the cameras that we have, we're not in person. I'm looking at you through a camera on my computer screen, and I can still see how much that's coming through. And that's really one of the ultimate goals that I have when I work with expectant parents is to have them have a birth that, even if things don't go exactly as they initially planned, that they still leave that birth with this sense of fulfillment and this sense of accomplishment, and they're able to look back on it and feel all of everything that they experienced on that day and everything that they were left with at the end of that birth. And feeling proud about what you accomplished is exactly what I hope that every new mom feels at the end of her birth. So congratulations. I'm really glad that even though you had to encounter all of these obstacles and with the transfer to the hospital, that you were still able to experience everything that birth has to offer for you. So that's great. Thank you so much for sharing this wonderful story with us. And now, can you tell us a bit about what you're planning for your second birth? What kind of birth environment are you planning this time around?
So second birth, we are going to, or we're planning to have this baby at a independent birth center. It's called the Birthing Inn. You might be familiar with it because we're in sort of the same area. We are doing that because of a few things. One, I am like I shouldn't say I'm very organized. I'm not. I wish I was. In my mind, my house always needs to be like clean in order for me to relax. It's really hard for me to ever get 100% where I want it to be, especially with a toddler. And so I feel like I would be very distracted and have a hard time relaxing if I was at home this time around. Also, I really, really found like my spot when I was in the shower at the hospital. And it's funny because my midwife had told us when we were planning our home birth and where we were going to set up the tub, she had said, I think we should put it in your room because, I mean, people tend to, she's like, it sounds very like primitive, but women often like to find a place that's like being like in a cave, like you're back where no one can surprise you, and like feeling like you're in a safe place. And so it's after the birth, I think, a couple days later, she's like, it's pretty funny to me that you ended up in the shower and we're in the bathroom, and that's where you were finally able to get to where you were comfortable and you felt like you were in charge of the labor, and you really felt in tune with your body because you were kind of in like that dark cave-like spot. And so all that being said, I really want that to be available to me. And at home, my mom was laughing at me when I told her this the other day, we'll run out of hot water so fast. It sounds really silly, but we'll run out of hot water. We have just regular like residential showers, nothing exciting. So I kind of want more like facility wise available to me. So that's why I picked it. Also, we live fairly rurally, and we would go to the same hospital if anything happened. And it's closer to an hour away now. We have since moved. So I lived in a different house when I was pregnant with my daughter. So that hospital is almost an hour away, and the birthing center is like 10 minutes from it. So just peace of mind, not that I don't feel like I need that peace of mind, but for practicality, it kind of makes sense as well, because if there was a true emergency, that is not where they would take us. They would take us again to the hospital that I didn't want to be at with my first. So I'd rather just be over there. So anyway, it was a really long answer to tell you that we will be at a birth center with the same midwife.
That's okay that you expanded, because I would have asked you to if you didn't.
Perfect.
Okay. So back to your first birth. So after you arrived at the hospital and your midwife had called the OB that she wanted to come in,
mm-hmm.
and then you guys were having this back and forth, I'm curious who was orchestrating that. Was that you? Was that your midwife? Was that a combination?
Back and forth
about who the attending OB would be?
Oh, so that was with, it was not me communicating. Communication is not my strong suit. especially communicating what I want and need. That was my husband and hospital staff. Like in fact, they even put us in the room and they wrote the on-call OB's name on our board. And he went and said, like, that is not our OB. We already told you. I would say that was probably the number one thing that they weren't thrilled about, was that, like, we weren't registered at the hospital at all. I've never been to this hospital before. We showed up, home birth transfer, and then we were telling them basically like who our OB was going to be. And our OB was totally on board with it. He was wonderful, but the like admitting staff and some of the nursing staff were not super great about that. But it was all a back and forth between my husband, my midwife, who was there at the time when we were checking in. She was with us. So it was like my husband and my midwife and the hospital staff, basically. And I was just sitting there like, can we just go to the room? Why do we have to talk about all of this?
Then you mentioned that when your midwife was giving you antibiotics en route, you said you would have, in hindsight, you would have probably asked more questions about that.
Yeah.
What do you feel like held you back from asking those questions?
I think two things. Probably the fact that I just trust her so much that if she tells me to do something, I'm like, great, okay. But also it was so unexpected. I'm very much a glass half full type of person. Everything's going to be all right. It's not a big deal. And so I did not prepare really for anything other than my home birth. Now, I knew that it was like all things were possible. And I knew that, you know, me and the baby would have to remain healthy and stable through the process to stay at home. But I did not prepare really for any sort of, interventions, things that might come up. I just really did not prepare well for that, because in my mind, I was like, it's going to be okay. People have babies all the time and it'll be great. So I think that is why. And if I was in the same position again, I would probably ask her a few more questions about why she wanted to start now, how necessary she really thinks it is, what risks is she concerned about. I probably even, in fact, I have an appointment with her tomorrow, and I'm going to talk to her a little bit more about if the meconium presented again this time, how comfortable would she be with, as long as me and the baby were stable, not transferring like at all. Obviously, if my baby is in distress and it's like continued distress, I'm not going to stay away from the hospital. I'd be the first one. I'd put myself in a car and drive myself there. But I mean, my water broke and we knew about the meconium almost 12 hours before she was born, and she was as healthy as can be. You know, there's that part of me now that's like, how much of that was necessary? Could we have monitored more at home and found that it would have been fine to stay there? So I think probably now, having been through the birthing process and having done a little bit more research, I would try to be a little bit more in control of the decisions. But because I had not prepared for any of that to happen at all, I really just let her take the reins.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you this from another angle. Do you think that there's any part of you that didn't question her about it because you didn't feel like you had the confidence in yourself to question her knowledge and question what she was doing? Like you would put her in a position to make her feel like you were questioning her actions?
That's a good question. I would say with my first pregnancy with her, I gave her a lot of authority. So one thing that I have spent a lot of time like thinking about, reading things from different angles about this during this pregnancy, is just the fact that there has been a shift between like basically mother-led birth and we're giving the authority to someone else. I never thought about that prior to being pregnant with this baby, but I do think that I gave her the authority that a normal person gives an OB. So it's kind of like I knew I was making the decision that I wanted a home birth and I wanted a natural perspective from my caregiver, but I then was like, perfect, I picked a caregiver, I trust you, so now you're in charge. So yeah, I think I did let her have the authority in the end, and so that's something that I now feel like I have more, and I definitely am comfortable to question. But yes, good question, because I haven't verbalized that myself, so that's helpful for me to think about.
Yes, and I think I'm going to use that to segue into, I have some more questions from your birth, but I think I'm going to segue into my next other question, and then we'll kind of bring these other pieces of things, some things that happened in that birth that I just kind of see as little things that we can tweak that might give you a little bit more power this next time around.
Yeah.
Okay, so you filled out a short questionnaire for me that helps me to understand how I can support you to strengthen some of these areas for this next birth. That the assessment that helps you understand kind of your dominant type, which ultimately will tell me a lot about how you communicate in all kinds of situations in your everyday life, with your husband at home, even with your daughter now and this second child to come, but definitely comes into play when we are dealing with situations between ourselves and a healthcare provider where we do feel like that other person with us does have some authority, partly because they have the knowledge base that we might be lacking, but there's ways that we can improve our communication in order to get the information that we need and not give up our power to them, but be able to use them as a resource and a guide through the process while we still maintain the ability to be the one who's actually in control of our birth.
Yeah.
So I would like to know, were you able to, with that assessment? So the assessment form, you're familiar with because you've seen it, but for people who are listening who haven't seen it, in the end, it's created such that there's 4 types and each type is associated with a different direction. So we talk about everything as being a compass and a map and a guide. So it's all in kind of this larger framework. So this is the initial step that I work with on people to kind of gauge where they are and how we can work with the strengths that they already have inherently and start to recognize where their natural challenges are based on their 1 of 4 types. So we have northeast, south, and west directions. So Starr, were you able to figure out what direction you are based on that assessment, which is your most dominant?
So most dominant was east. So I had 4 of my answers that fell under that. And then I had, I didn't even look at what the B and the C stood for, but I had 1 that was under B, like my answer was B, and then I had 2 that were C. But I only read the A one because I was like, yep, that's me.
Okay. Okay, so you are an east. And then you had how many of the other letters?
I had 1 B and 2 C's.
Okay, so as an east, so you kind of like to have control of things. Which makes sense with the feeling that's part of why you've chosen birth center over your house, because you feel like you're not going to be able to have every bit of your home prepared for the birth by the time it arrives. So it's feeling like that home environment might be a little bit too much out of control, where the birth center, everything's going to be in its place that it needs to be when you get there. So that makes sense. And that also makes a lot of sense for me with how the transition in going from what you had planned to where you ended up, why that made things even more difficult for you, where you felt like you couldn't open up and let go at the hospital, because that was outside of your original plan, right?
Yeah.
And you were so tied to having that home birth that you didn't even pack your hospital bag. You didn't have anything ready. You didn't even know what hospital you would go to in case you did have to transfer, which can be very typical. Some East people would have all of those things ready to go because they plan for every kind of situation.
Right.
But I think for you, because you were so kind of stuck in this one particular way that your birth was going to happen and the place that it would happen in, that you couldn't even see the other possibilities.
Yeah.
So for you, one of the things to be kind of focusing on and working on is how to allow things to be a little bit out of your control. Now, that might be a little bit easier for you now because you have a toddler and that naturally forces you to relinquish some of that controlling aspect of things, because they take over and they disrupt a lot of your organization. So having a toddler is going to be very good for you. So figuring out ways to kind of let go of control and thinking outside of the birth center, just in case, right? And you probably will be more ready for it this time anyway, just because you had that experience last time. So now you're very aware that it can be a reality and why it happens and how it happens and what all of that looks like. But ideally, we're going to get you to a place where this doesn't happen. And in one of our future sessions, I have some other stuff. I know one of the things you wanted to address was exercise and stretching. And I think probably for positioning is where you're going with that. And we definitely can address some things for that. I have some core breathing exercise things that I will have you start to work on that will help just ensure the muscle structure is going to be most optimal for getting baby into the right position. And also if you're interested in doing a little bit of nutrition coaching with all of this, we can do that too. Because there's actually some nutrition components that can help with a lot of the things that I think you experienced, both with getting baby in right position, but also with the prodromal type labor that you had where just for so many days, it didn't ever build up. Sometimes there's a nutritional route in that as well as the positioning. So those are things we can go over like maybe third or fourth time that we meet. So today I want to focus a little bit more on helping you understand how to communicate, because you said it's not one of your strong points, and working on being present. So people who are in the East, they're often thinking about what's going to happen next. They're kind of the planning for the future types. So for you, kind of coming into that present place and really focusing on what's happening here and now and getting out of the trying to control what's happening here and now, but just being with it and allowing things to happen a little bit more freely and a little bit more loosely and kind of letting go of the thinking part of it, which it sounds like you were trying to do a lot. And sometimes that external environment was trying to pull you back in the conversations that you were trying to get out of. So you could try to be in your space. So we'll want to give you some tools to help you with that as well. The other piece that was interesting is the struggling. So I want to dive a little bit more into what that struggling piece was feeling like for you. So were you feeling like that before the hospital, where you felt like you were really struggling? And
no,
it's not until after.
Felt like, oh my word, this is so intense. But I did not feel like I can't do this until I got to the hospital. And it was like right when I walked in the room, I just lost like the confidence that I could do it. I lost complete control of my thoughts. And I even, started thinking like, I totally understand why so many people get epidurals now. Like I get it. And I don't know if I can do this. I had actually told the nurse, I don't think I mentioned this. I told the nurse when I was in the tub, I told her, you can just give me a knife. I'll cut it out right now. Like I'm not doing this, because I think there was just a big piece of it that was like, this isn't what I signed up for. Like I thought I knew what I signed up for, and this wasn't it.
And I'm sure you're not the first person that she heard that exact statement from.
Probably not.
So the struggling, do you feel like the struggling was more from the loss of control of the situation because of the transfer? Or do you feel like it was specifically from the pain? Or do you feel like that pain was getting ahead of you because you weren't able to control it the way you had been before you were in the hospital?
I think it was kind of a combination of what you just said. Because I lost control, that is when I kind of enter my anxious state, which I have never struggled a ton with anxiety, but when I do, it's like I don't have like constant anxiety. I will almost have like anxiety attacks when I lose control. And it started when I was pretty young. Like I was from a family of 7 kids. There was at least 9 of us, like everywhere we went. And I remember being 14, 15, and I would literally like, sounds horrible, but I'd like start yelling at like my parents and my siblings, like, because they weren't on time. And in my mind, you had to be on time somewhere. And it was so stressful to me. And as soon as I started driving, like I would drive separately to places because I would just get so much anxiety about the fact that like everybody didn't have their life together. And so I think that when I went there, it was like I lost control of the situation. The same thing will happen like if I have a plan for dinner and it just happens to be a day where my child wants me to do nothing but hold her and she wants to scream and cry and my husband can't go near her because, you know, she wants mom. And those have been, I have gotten a lot better at recognizing, okay, you're allowing yourself to get really anxious right now. But those are even the times where I can think back to myself, like standing in the kitchen, just thinking, I can't do this. It's like when I lose control, when the plan changes, I just want to like evacuate the whole thing. And so all of that being said, I think when that really hit me when I walked in the room and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm in a hospital room to have a baby. And because I reached that just anxious, I'm all done, I can't do this because my plan didn't work spot, that the pain then got worse. And that's, I can't even think of what book I'm thinking back to, but it might be Childbirth Without Fear. That's one of the ones that I read in my first pregnancy. And, you know, he basically talks a lot about like the fear causing the pain. And I think for me, that was it. It was just, it was like, I wasn't scared, but I was very anxious. And so I think that's where the pain came from. And now if you ask me, like when I talk to other moms about childbirth, I hate to use the word pain because I don't want to like scare people into thinking they can't do it. The intensity of the pressure I translated to pain for like a few hours there. Basically in the afternoon from probably noon to 4, it was like, instead of realizing, like I never was present enough to be like, okay, Starr, your body is doing this to open up and let your baby. I never even was able to slow down enough to tell myself that. I just was like, it hurts, make it stop. And I think that just comes from entering that like anxious, I've lost all control state.
Yes. So all of those things are very, very typical of people who are strong easts. You are definitely very strong in your east direction. Yeah. So one of the, you know, as you read on the assessment, like one of the things for people in the east to do is to kind of slow down and get a little bit introspective and take some time for yourself, but also just take time to slow down and be in the moment. Because people who are east, they tend to be go, 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 right? They're always on to the next thing. It's that future thing. You know, the east, a lot of east people are very innovative people, and they're great people for us to have in society because they bring all of these future, you know, things that are kind of futuristic at the time. Yeah. They're kind of the creators. They're the people who are able to think of these things and have that kind of energy to bring them into the world. And when they have great follow through, they come up with these ideas and they're able to actually bring them to life. Mm-hmm. But they tend to not take a lot of time to build up their strength, to build up their energy, which is part of what we're going to talk about in one of the future sessions too. And part of where I think some things held up your labor from progressing, just in that kind of nurturing and reserving some of that energy for the labor and birth. But what we need to do is get you to a point where you can be present and hold control, even if things have to change.
Yeah.
So if something does happen again, or something unexpected happen, even if it's not to that level where you actually have to transfer to the hospital, but something unexpected, that you're able to pivot and go with that, even though it's not on your plan.
Yeah.
And then a lot of that is going to be just prepping you physically as well, so that your body is more prepared this time to go through that process and not get stuck at these points. And all of these points that you tended to get stuck at, they are kind of pivots between when you go into the course and you see how all of the 4 different directions that are on that assessment, they all work together, and we all have aspects of all of them. You're using them all the time, but where you tend to get stuck is this pivot spot that is related to being able to boost up that east and allow it to come into its full power so you can utilize those strengths to their full capacity. But what was happening for you is because some of the other spots are off, because you're so strong in your east, that your east wasn't getting the nourishment that it needed. Like each thing comes before the other and they're nourishing and building up. But some of the other spots were a little bit weak. And so you kept getting stuck in this spot, like all of these areas where something like this next thing that came up, and then this next thing that came up, the contractions didn't build up intensity, and then the water breaking, but there being meconium, and then transferring to the hospital and having this loss of control. They're all in the same spot on this cycle. So it repeats again and again. And as you go through the course, I walk you through different ways to kind of see this happening in other aspects of your life. So you're going to see that it's probably something that's been very repetitive for you.
Yeah.
And you'll be able to identify it because you'll start to see how you're still doing it now, how you've been doing it. How it shows up in your parenting, how it shows up in your spousal relationship, in, relationships with your friends, with your extended family, and in identifying it in all these ways, you're going to be able to identify it even in birth, so that you can say, oh, I'm doing this. And you'll have developed tools to fix it, so that when you can identify it, you know what to do in order to get yourself back out of it again. So that's where in the long run, we're going to try to go. So by the time you get to this birth, you have a bunch of resources, you have the ability to identify these spots where you might get stuck. And, if things change, it doesn't matter. You're going to be fluid enough to transition through it. The other area that I want to cover, so your husband was part of the conversation about getting the OB. Now, when other things were happening, like the doctor wanted you to be on your back on the bed, but your midwife was trying to advocate for you just to stay with the squat bar. And then the lidocaine situation, was your husband comfortable advocating for you in those situations where physically you can't put the energy into doing that?
That's a really good question. And we have just started talking about that recently. If you'd asked me 2 months ago, I would not have known the answer, but my midwife encouraged me and him to start talking about the birth more, so that as a couple, we're a little bit more prepared. And one thing that I didn't realize, because I tend to just shut down and do a really bad job about communicating what I think I need or want, he has since told me he really had no idea about what mental state I was in. So for example, he's talked about those things and they made him really uncomfortable. And so one thing that I think was surprising to him, and I don't know to what degree, if he expected it a little bit, but it was just shocking. At the hospital, he felt like anytime they'd ask a question, they would ask me. They would look at me and they would totally disregard him. If he asked questions, they would look back and answer to me. He felt very disregarded and you're not the patient, so you have no rights kind of a feeling was what he got. So he was kind of taking signals from me okay, well, she's not arguing it, So I guess she's okay. And at one point I actually said out loud, and I don't remember if it was when he was trying to get me to lay down or if it was when he did the lidocaine cream, but I actually said to my midwife and him, I was like, I don't care. Like, I literally said, whatever, I don't care, because I just couldn't think about it. But all he heard was, like, all he knows is, okay, my wife is having a baby and I have no idea like how present she is and what's her headspace. Like, he obviously has never seen anyone else have a baby. I'm just like, whatever, I don't care. So he did not at any point say anything to the doctor about either of those things. He wishes now that he had, but he didn't feel like he had the place to. He felt like the hospital staff didn't give him that. And because I never communicated to him, like, I need your help, he didn't know, like, am I supposed to? Is it okay? Is she going to be upset if I do? Like, I mean, historically, me telling him I need help is like a huge, broader issue. I don't like to ask for help. And it's funny because my daughter does the exact same thing. And I started telling her about 6 months ago, I'm like, I know, honey, but mommy doesn't like to ask for help either, but I can really help you right now. And I'll even say, I'll let you keep trying, but let me know when you're ready for help. And she has started in the last couple months doing a lot better, and she'll try whatever it is. She's very stubborn, but she will eventually ask for help. And I'm trying to like teach that out of her now because I hate asking for help. So because I never communicated that to him, he was like, I guess she's fine, and I don't want, if she's okay, I don't want to override what we had previously talked about, because he knew I didn't want to lay on my back when I was delivering a baby, and he knew I wasn't comfortable with like all sorts of interventions, basically anything unnecessary he knew I didn't want. But since I was there and I wasn't arguing it, he's like, I guess she changed her mind. And then he just didn't know in that moment like what was okay and what wasn't okay.
And the not asking for help thing, again, that's very typical of an East. And it can be very typical of an East because you are a very independent type generally, and you're often used to being able to just accomplish big tasks all on your own, big goals on your own, often just out of sheer will and determination. So that's definitely a big trait that we see common among East personality types. Your daughter might be an East also. You'll find out. So 2 things that I definitely want to make sure you guys hit is the birth plan course and the birth partner video. The birth partner video is pretty short. And he'll actually do an assessment like you, so he knows what direction he is. Then just bring what he is to our next meeting. And we can talk about strategies for the 2 of you to work together so that you're communicating together better. So I'm curious, before you saying this and you guys starting to talk about this, would he have known that you are the kind of person who can kind of shut down in a stressful situation like that and just not communicate? Would he have been able to pinpoint that, or was that not necessarily something he was aware of at the time?
I don't know that he would have at the time. What he didn't do was pinpoint that was what was happening. He definitely knows that about me, because basically it doesn't matter what it is. If it goes against my plan, I just get very short, and I don't want to, I really get to a place where I'm just done. Whatever it is, I'm like, I'm done. And so he knows that, but what specifically he's asked me multiple times is, where are you at? Like, when you're having a baby, where are you? I need to know, like, mentally, like, what are you capable of doing? And that's something that, honestly, I don't know if I could have prepared him for anyway, because I definitely thought I would be a lot more in control of where I was prior to having a baby. But he, in the moment, didn't know if what was happening was like that I was shut down, or that I was like having a baby and plans are changing and I need to just let her do her thing. And because people were asking me, or not necessarily asking, it would depend on the thing, but asking me or informing me, because he watched like the communication happen to me and me not deny it or argue it, he was like, okay, I don't want to like basically be the jerk that is like, no, you don't want to do that. You know, he felt like it would be stepping on my toes since he didn't know where I was. So that's been his number one thing that he has said to me over and over again, that he like wants to understand, like, do I say something or do I not? Which I have told him, I'm like, you absolutely like could have and should have said those things. Like, I think I also am very assumptive. I tend to make like strong assumptions about not just him, other people. And I just assumed like, I mean, me and him are like a unit. I assumed like, this is what we're doing together. And you can't like hurt my feelings or step on my toes as we're going through this process. But, you know, from his perspective, it's like, well, she's the one having the baby. I'm here to help, but I don't know what that means.
Okay. Well, I'll be interested to see where he comes out on this assessment, and maybe you already have some ideas.
I'm sure that I could probably guess, but yeah. And then we'll see how to, you know, there's different ways for the different directions to work together to create a really powerful team, but you have to first be aware of what your own is, and then you have to be aware of what each other's is, and then you know how to work off of each other. So that will give him a little bit more awareness of when and how to step in for you, and how to communicate with you to, you know, take some of the pressure off, but actually know if what is happening is what you really want to do versus you're just too tired to answer and don't want to, you don't want to be the one necessarily having the fight for something because you don't have the energy to do that or the headspace to do that. But you might know that later you're going to look back on it and think, gosh, I wish that they wouldn't have done that. But you know that you didn't have the capacity to battle it. But the birth partner is there to help you with exactly those things, as well as be your support person, but also to help you, you know, to be your voice when you don't have a voice. So we want to make sure that he feels confident in doing that with you, and that you feel like you have him to depend on when you need someone to be that voice for you. So we will bring that in next time as well, when I have an idea of where he is on that spectrum. Okay. So I think that's all of my questions for today, unless you had any questions. No, I don't think so. I'm excited. This is helpful. This actually already has been helpful, so I'm really excited.
Great.
To do the course and then to continue to get to talk about some of those things that can help.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I think with this kind of stuff that you're working on, the level that you're on, I think that you're going to get some interesting, unique things out of it. So cool. Thank you so much for joining me on this coaching session. If you would like to be considered for a coaching call on the Journey to Birth podcast, visit naturalbirthcompass.com/podcast and fill out our questionnaire, including your contact info, and I will be in touch. Finally, if you want to show our amazing guest Starr some love for being vulnerable on this show and allowing us all to learn along with her, leave a comment for this podcast or share it with someone you love who will benefit as well. Need to reach me? Find me on the socials at Natural Birth Compass or visit the website naturalbirthcompass.com. See you again on your journey to birth.